Right, Kenya has tightened security in the capital, Nairobi, and other cities in the country. This after several European countries warned of the risk of possible attacks.
Heavily armed police officers were patrolling the streets of Nairobi on Friday, and tight security was also visible outside government offices, public buildings and shopping malls. The French embassy in Kenya has issued a warning to its citizens against a risk of attack in the coming days in Nairobi, recommending to avoid places frequented by foreign nationals such as hotels, restaurants and shopping centres. The French Foreign Ministry has reiterated the real risk of terrorist attacks in Kenya against public places frequented by foreigners. The German embassy issued a similar warning to its citizens, while the Dutch representation said it had been informed by the French of the possible threat, describing the information as credible. Since its military intervention in southern Somalia in 2011 to fight the Somali militant group Al-Shabaab, Kenya has been the target of several deadly attacks. These include the Westgate shopping mall attack in Nairobi in September 2013, in which 67 people were killed. The April 2015 attack on the University of Garissa, which killed 148 people. And in January 2019, 21 people were killed in an attack on the Dusit Hotel complex in Nairobi. In January 2020, the Al-Shabaab, a movement linked to Al-Qaeda, warned Kenya that the country would never be safe. Kenya is a major troop contributor to the African Union mission in Somalia, AMISOM, which in 2011 drove the Al-Shabaab out of Mogadishu. The Al-Shabaab still control large rural areas and regularly carry out attacks in the Somali capital.
Okay, to share more insights on this story, we are now joined by governance and security expert Abdullahi Boru Halakhe. He speaks to us all the way from Washington, D.C. in the United States. Abdullahi, a very good evening to you. Good to talk to you again. Let's talk about this latest alert. Is it just France and Germany, or is it meant for all foreign nationals on Kenyan soil?
Thank you, Tapita. I think generally when Western countries issue these, security alerts, it's targeted to their citizens. But naturally, when their citizens, let's say those who are working in the embassies or they are working in the country, the information finds itself in the media, and then everybody starts picking some of the signals. But the reality is, this is not surprising. These are standard practices that Western countries employ for safety and security reasons. It's largely, charters within the intelligence community, or, communication intercepts that they obtain. And so therefore, as a matter of course, they will tell their citizens to avoid, places that, their citizens tend to visit, shopping malls and high-end areas in Nairobi and its environs.
So, as you say, this is something that embassies would send to its nationals. And I want to look at a statement by Kenya's police spokesman, Bruno Shioso. He's apparently said they are aware of the alert, but that there's no reason to fear at the moment. What are your thoughts around this? Is it because that they don't think the security risk is that high, or they're just trying to maintain calm?
I think it's the latter. You would want to. You don't want. I mean, one of the things that you do not want in this kind of an environment is to cause that anxiety, which quote unquote is what terrorists want, for you to be afraid, for you not to go about your business. But that has to be balanced with the reality that Kenya has been at the receiving end of some of the worst attacks by Al-Shabaab. But at this stage, I think, we shouldn't only concentrate on Al-Shabaab. ADF is inside, inside the Democratic Republic of Congo. In your neighboring country in Mozambique, we've got groups like Al-Shabaab that are fighting. So and you've seen yesterday, Tanzanian president was meeting the Mozambican counterpart. And yesterday, the security operation inside the Democratic Republic of Congo arrested a Kenyan who was part of ADF, who in the past traveled to Turkey, and he was returned to Kenya on the suspicion that he was a member of ISIS. So I think there are a lot of things that are going on in the region, and naturally, you've got to take a bit of caution, but at the same time, you have to strike a sweet balance between caution and being fearful of the whole thing. And I think it's reasonable for the police spokesperson to strike a far more conciliatory tone, saying that we shouldn't be afraid and we are aware of this. The last thing you want is, terror or worries and fear spreading through the citizens.
Abdullahi, let's examine the threat and to whom or from whom it comes from. You mentioned Al-Shabaab, and I want to reflect back on, in March 2021, we had the Interior Minister of Kenya ordering the closure of the Dadaab and Kakuma refugee camps. And this was on fears of further attacks from Al-Shabaab. And we mentioned in the introduction, the insert before we spoke to you about the 2013, the 2015, the 2017 attacks. Is the threat only from within Kenya, and I'm talking about Kenya, just Al-Shabaab? What other militant groups are there? And can you also just talk about the distinction between terrorism and extremism and why that is important?
Thank you so much. I think the reality is, in the interest of the viewers who are not, without necessarily getting into the weeds of these groups, what happened was, we have Al-Shabaab in Somalia, but as with any franchise that involves, terrorist groups, they do not necessarily what you would call, a branch, but they have people who are Kenyans, right, from where they have recruited over the last few years, and we have it on record. One of the, Amir, who is a leader in Somalia, who is a Kenyan, all right? And so as a result, because of these concerns and worries, the Kenyan government, after a series of attacks that were allegedly blamed on the group, kidnapping of Western humanitarian worker in the northeastern part, which borders Somalia, and along the coast that also borders Somalia via the Indian Ocean. Kenya sent its troops into Somalia in 2011. But the thing was, up to that point, the attacks from Al-Shabaab weren't necessarily targeting Kenyans as their primary targets. They were targeting the Western interest, but Kenyans were collateral damage. All those attacks that you've listed there were attacks that Al-Shabaab, after Kenya's intervention, they said, we will bring the war to your doorsteps. And all those attacks happened after Kenya intervened inside Somalia. So in terms of the primary group that we should be focusing on at this particular moment, in terms of the threat to Kenya, it is the Al-Shabaab. And we have it on record of all those attacks, the Garissa attack, Dusit attack, as well as the Westgate Mall attacks. But one thing that I want to, for the viewers out there to understand is that whereas Kenya has a fairly porous border with Ethiopia as well as Somalia, over the last few years, the Kenya's security and intelligence agencies have improved in how they not only gather the information, that is the intelligence information, and how they share those information, as well as how they respond. The first major attack was at the Westgate Mall. I think the response was almost farcical. But after that, the last one, which was in Dusit, the mall, the response was fairly well. The anti-terror agency came very quickly. And over the years, because of training, support, experience in incorporating the lesson learned from the field that is inside Somalia, but also within, the response has been good. But then again, when you're dealing with a group like Al-Shabaab or like any other Al-Shabaab terrorist groups, it becomes very, very difficult. The margins of error are almost negligible. They need one attack in a year or in a month to make you feel like you're vulnerable. To your question about, violent extremist groups versus, terrorist groups, what happened was after September 11th, the international community, including multilateral institutions and the UN, came up with a framework of fighting terrorism, anti-terror, framework, legislation, and administrative structures that were led by the United Nations and the US, that many countries adopted, including Kenya, that passed, Prevention of Terrorism Act of 2006, yeah. And so as a result, we had agencies that were dealing with this. But then again, over the last few years, there has, been a realization that, counterterrorism primarily focuses on using of, military force. It is not very well in dealing with this. And now we have something we call countering violence or preventing violence extremism. And this largely focuses on the soft aspect. How is recruitment done? How can we get them? Narrative and counter narrative. And in many ways, it's largely a preventative rather than a reactive after the event. And but the classification of which groups belong to that either terrorist or violent extremism, it's very thin line, and there tend to be an overlap.
Okay, so because we are talking about this particular point, and we'll come back to the threat faced by the region, particularly the Horn of Africa, and political events or security instances that have occurred that will threaten it, I want to focus on what you're talking about, counterterrorism, particularly how Western nations can collaborate with their local counterparts where they have interests without interfering, without crossing that line. And I want to point to an attack that occurred in 2020 in Kenya. It was for the first time that Al-Shabaab attacked US forces inside of Kenya. And obviously, this does raise the ire, particularly of Americans who are seen as cowboy, gung-ho style in their pursuit of these terrorist or Islamist groups inside of Africa, where they seek influence as well. So how do you balance that? Western nations collaborating with their local African counterparts without crossing that line of interference?
And I think that is a really, really important question. I think what has happened is that in the name of fighting terrorism, Western countries have, particularly the United States, France in West Africa, as well as the United Kingdom, they have deepened their training, technical support that is largely involving, giving the technology to most of African countries, as well as training where, most of the officers come to the United States or the UK or France to learn and study. All right. But, it's very important for us to take into account how, this training, establishment of these local authorities, security agencies, new security agencies to fight, terrorist groups are really problematic. If you look at, everybody is saying the number of coups across the continent have increased. But strangely, some of the officers that are carrying out some of those coups are actually officers that have gone to the United States and elsewhere for training. So are these training, military support, technical support, are they actually conducive? Secondly, you touched about on something that is very critical. At what point do you draw a line between Western military support and your territorial integrity and sovereignty? These are very important questions. A lot of the time, some of these military bases do not operate within the framework of the host country's legal policy frameworks. For instance, the United States has military bases spread across the continent, right? And it has a base in Djibouti as well. It has, not a base, but a forward operating facility, which was attacked by Al-Shabaab. That is the one that you referenced, that is inside Kenya. What are the rules of engagement when it comes to some of these bases or operation within some of these countries? I'll give you an example. Kenya also has a training facility for the UK forces, just closer to the center of the country, but on the northern part of the country. Some of the military officers, right, they are the ones who brought in COVID to that part of the country. Some of the military officers, after a night out of drinking, torched acres of land. Some of the military officers, one was actually involved in a rape and murder case of a young Kenyan. That case is still pending. And so I think there are so many other questions that need to be untangled, and the rules are not very clear. The parliament is hardly involved. It's largely done at the executive level. And, we've not seen some of the records of the contracts that were signed, whilst at the same time, right, you get all this support, but you're also opening yourselves up for attacks from some of these groups that see you as being aligned with the United States or the Western countries.
Abdullahi, before we run out of time, let's go back now to the region. You mentioned Kenya's involvement in Somalia and how that has made it vulnerable to attacks from Al-Shabaab. I want to look at the Horn of Africa particularly, and why events over the past couple of months and the upcoming months could make it even more vulnerable. We've seen the fighting that is happening in Ethiopia, the government versus the Tigray region. Somalia's delayed elections. Kenya is preparing for its own elections. Some are saying just this could render it more vulnerable to an escalation in attacks. So domestic counter-terrorism, how is it best managed to also prevent your neighbor from using this as an excuse to invade your territory or to stoke a war that could then benefit you? We know that a lot of the conflicts on the African continent, somewhere or another, a neighbor is involved in meddling.
No, thank you. That is very important. I think for most of I think if you study terrorism and counterterrorism, one of the things that stands out is at the core, most of these problems is the governance gap, where, the government either is not present at all, so nature doesn't like vacuum. And so these groups come and fill in the space. That is what is happening across the Sahel and in most of the Horn of Africa region. With respect to all these moving events in the region, they obviously will make the region fairly vulnerable. And this is a region that, across the continent is known fairly well as fairly volatile, even outside terrorism. But the events over in the next few months would make that level of vulnerability even to go higher. However, in the Kenyan case, I think there is a fair degree of preparedness as we go into the elections naturally, and that will play into that. With respect to what is going on in Tigray as well as Somalia, that makes it fairly difficult because in the case of Somalia, where the government doesn't have a good or firm grip on its territory, that is why we see Al-Shabaab being fairly stronger in there, despite AMISOM's presence. Ethiopia is very difficult because if, for instance, hypothetical again, groups like TPLF work with Al-Shabaab or they give them even access to that side of the country, you're looking at a lot of problems. I think this is a fair way of saying that it's complex and complicated, but I think peace and security and stability goes a long way in, blunting the impact of groups like Al-Shabaab and other violent extremist groups.
Thank you so much for speaking to us, as always, sharing your insights with us. And that there is Abdullahi Boru Halakhe, who is a security expert, just speaking to us there about the situation in Kenya, the Horn of Africa, and Africa as a region, just with regards to terrorism. This after there was an alert issued by the German and French embassies saying that their citizens ought to beware of a possible terror attack inside of Kenya. Well,